We need money for everything, but I know grants don't like to cover operational costs. Is there a creative way around this? So, a little similar to our last question, but I do want to address this one specifically because whether you're an emerging archives or collection program or not, all of us have operational costs that we need to cover. And in way too many cases, unfortunately, we don't have the operational budget to meet all of those operational costs. And so for us, what really should be funded by our organization every year, sometimes that's just not the reality available to us. And so seeking donor funding or grant funding to help fill the gaps, essentially. And so because granting agencies do tend to frown upon funding operational costs because legitimately it's something your organization should be supporting, there's some creative ways that we can go about this. And one of the ways is to break them out in phases. So, for example, if your organization should be funding a yearly allotment for archival supplies, but you just don't have the budget this year for that, then pick a collection that you want to work on that you could get grant funding for to help fund and buy some of those supplies. Another way to do this is you need to buy collections management software, which has an annual cost with it. But if you're able to put together a project and choose a collection to work on for that year, sometimes you can package it as a more discrete thing that may have operational annual components to it. And yet it's still this discrete project that the granting agency can feel good about pointing to and identifying, yes, we funded that. Another thing to consider is working with your organization to develop a long-term plan to cover these costs. Operational costs, by their very nature, should be funded by your organization. And if your organization can't fund those things, then there should really be some reassessment as to what's happening, which is a whole other webinar in terms of where your income streams come from and how you're prioritizing your budget. But for this case, even if you're able to get grant money or donors to cover a portion of your work, you were not going to be able to do that year after year. One, you shouldn't, but two, the granting agencies aren't going to be interested in funding it beyond just that 1 year. And so your organization, you're going to need to work with them to have a plan of, okay, if I can get a donor or a granting agency to fund this piece for this year, you as my organization need to commit to the annual cost of that for the next at least 5 years or something like that. So make sure you're having that conversation as well. And then another piece of advice is I usually like to work with both donors and grants to put together and help supplement what these costs are. For example, like both donors and granting agencies want to fund the bright, shiny, pretty things that they can splash up on their press releases and on their websites to say, hey, we funded this great, really pretty, shiny, interesting thing. Nobody wants to fund the rebinding of a book or like some of the more boring or tedious. I mean, like you and I, we find this interesting and we know it's important, but maybe not the donors or the granting agency. So usually what I do is I make this a larger project where there are bright, shiny things, and then there's also like structural, maybe boring things for them, but they have to come together. And while the grant money might technically fund the boring things, it's still tied to this larger project with a shiny outcome. And so the granting agency can still point to that shiny outcome, even though they funded like the boring structural thing, and feel good about it. So that's how I sort of creatively get around that and have everybody feel good about it and have us still be able to do our jobs.